Hello, welcome to Jazz Is
Jazz's
MasterClass series
at the National Jazz Museum at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem.
I am Sekou McMillan, the curator of special projects.
My name is Albert Marquez, Zack O'Farrell.
My name is Shirazette Titten.
And we are in conversation with the legendary Bertha Hope. Jazz could only have happened here in America.
The key to everything was the radio.
So this world is too dense. 15 minutes isn't enough to cover it all.
Are you ready? I am.
I personally don't think Bird and Diz had anything against dance music. They both played in a lot of dance bands in their day, but they had, in the environment of this country, they felt they needed to make that statement that what we are doing has... Part 3 of Jazz History Tree Latin Jazz. I'm Zack O'Farrell. Today we're talking about the New York sound. Now, I know we just talked about New York, but the New York sound I'm imagining is a little more recently developed, a little more specific to New York and our musical values as New Yorkers. You know, I'm a New Yorker. It's a specialty of mine to understand New York values. Steve Coleman always says New Yorkers rush their time. It's probably true. But before we get into that, I left us off in our last episode talking about jazz and Latin music separating again a little bit after the 52nd Street Palladium bebop big band era, the parallel mambo bebop era. Because what happens after rock music begins to explode, after R&B and soul they develop over the course of the 50s, 60s, 70s, jazz becomes a less popular type of music. That jazz doesn't die. We get all sorts of incredible explorations in jazz, free jazz, jazz fusion. You know, hard bop continues to develop, and jazz stays very much a live and vibrant music. And some of my favorite records are from the 60s and 70s. But it's getting to be a little more niche than it was in the 30s and 40s, right? And what's happening on the other side, in the Latin side, you know, Latin music having more of that, for lack of a more erudite word, that more danceable quality, right? Latin music stays a dance music, right? Part of what Bird and Diz were doing with bebop was saying, our music doesn't have to be dance music, right? Bebop is not intended to be dance music. I personally don't think Bird and Diz had anything against dance music. They both played in a lot of dance bands in their day, but they had, in the environment of this country, they felt they needed to make that statement that what we are doing has intellectual value. What we are doing is intellectually rigorous. It's not just for people to dance. It's not just music to be sold. It's music for artistic fulfillment. Whereas at the Palladium, part of what the Palladium was known for was dancing, right? So while jazz becomes a less marketable music, Latin music kind of goes the other direction and incorporates some of what's happening with popular music at the time, incorporates some of what's happening with rock and soul, and develops into something called boogaloo, which then further develops into salsa. So on the Latin music side of things, we can trace a direct line from son through the mambo era into boogaloo and salsa. And now salsa is what people tend to think of when we think of Latin music, right? So that's even if they don't know that it's salsa, that's what comes to a lot of people's inner ear when they're thinking, oh, Latin rhythms, Latin music, that's what it is, right? So you have this separating of these two spheres of music going on throughout the 60s and the 70s and 80s. And there's all sorts of incredible music being made on both sides, right? We talked about fusion. We can talk about, the Blue Note, the classic, the real height of the Blue Note era, some of those Wayne Shorter records, those Art Blakey records, right? We can talk about Chicoria and Return to Forever and fusion and the Mahavishnu Orchestra, right? We can talk about Ornette. We can talk about Albert Ayler. We can talk about free jazz, right? on the salsa side of things, we talk about Eddie Palmieri, we talk about the Fania All Stars, we talk about Willie Colon and Ruben Blades making some of the most seminal records today that you put some of these songs on, and my mother-in-law in Colombia still just can't not dance, right? So we have all sorts of incredible music happening, and here's the dirty little secret about it is a lot of the musicians themselves were hip to what was going on both sides. We still have a lot of musicians in New York. We have all sorts of jazz musicians, all sorts of jazz trumpet and trombone players who are making their rent playing salsa gigs, right? And we have all these salsa musicians, Papo Luca, Andy Gonzalez, Eddie Palmieri, who are huge jazz nerds. They love jazz. Yet commercially, these music are maintained separate, right? So what begins to happen, I mentioned a couple of these names already, but what happens is we're now starting to have generations of musicians born in the 50s and 60s in New York who are really growing up with both musics, particularly if you look at young Latino musicians in New York, like Andy Gonzalez, like Jerry Gonzalez, like Eddie Palmieri, right? Like my dad, Arturo O'Farrell, right? This is just to name very few. This is just to name a very limited set. Well, the one I really want to make sure I don't forget to name is the drummer Steve Berrios, who really connects the dots in an important way. You get this generation of musicians in New York who are Latino by heritage, whatever that means, because that could be a whole other video series. Who are Latino by heritage and grow up with their parents' mambo records, grow up hearing salsa in the salsa era, but they love jazz. They're into fusion. They're into rock. They're checking out Dizzy Gillespie and Wayne Shorter and Art Blakey, and so when they're coming of age in the 70s and the 80s, they're starting to really connect the dots. They're starting to say, like, okay, I got all these jazz chops. I can improvise. I understand the harmony. I understand this language. And I understand the, like I said before, like what Bird and Diz and Thelonious Monk were pushing for, the intellectual rigor of improvisation, right? The intellectual rigor and the extraordinarily high level demands of harmonic knowledge and fluency necessary to do that type of jazz improvisation on a high level. And yet they also love and appreciate and understand and are connected to these rhythms, to this other style, right? So they start really putting it together, right? You have a musician like Andy Gonzalez playing with both Manny Oquendo's various orchestras and with Dizzy Gillespie, right? And his brother too. They were the rhythm. Andy would play bass and Jerry would play congas in salsa bands and in jazz bands at the same time. You had clubs like the Village Gate, where there was the salsa meets jazz jam session every week, where musicians from both sides would get together and play. They would be playing jazz tunes over Latin rhythms. They'd be introducing jazz harmony over Latin rhythms in a way that really hadn't been done since the 50s. When I talk about the New York sound, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this meetup. And really, there's one particular band that comes to mind that really ties it together, that really shows you what this synthesized sound is. And that's Jerry Gonzalez and the Fort Apache Band. Andy and Jerry Gonzalez, two brothers from the Bronx, both went to Music and Art High School, which my high school alma mater, LaGuardia, is what music and art turned into eventually. They grew up with an equal love and fascination for Latin music and jazz. And so when they put together the band Fort Apache, that original lineup was Andy Gonzalez on bass, Jerry Gonzalez on trumpet and congas, Steve Berrios on drums, Larry Willis on the piano, John Stubblefield on tenor, and Joe Ford on alto sax. And they were the first band to be taking straight ahead jazz tunes and really playing them authentically over Latin rhythms, understanding how to implement that rhythmic language into their improvisation, understanding how to implement that harmonic language over Latin rhythms. And that band has basically became an academy for the next generation of cats coming out of New York, coming simultaneously out of the New York jazz and Latin scenes. People like my dad, Arturo Farrell, people like Papo Vasquez. So many important musicians that I'm having a complete memory lapse because I'm just overwhelmed by how many people have been directly influenced by that band. But even if you look at some they continue to influence even younger generations. Look at the Curtis brothers, Zack Curtis, Lucas Curtis. These are all coming straight out of that distinctly New York sound of the Fort Apache band. And I just want to point out, Fort Apache, named after the Fort Apache siege of a Bronx police precinct in the, I want to say, late 70s, when the Bronx was burning. There was a siege of a police precinct that was nicknamed Fort Apache, that lasted for several days, and it left them, when Andy and Jerry were kids, were teenagers, and it left a mark. It became an identity. It became part of that counter-cultural revolutionary identity of the Bronx, connected with the Young Lords, right? All these things were happening simultaneously. All these things, you can't separate the music from the history of the place, right? When we talk about Andy and Jerry in the Bronx, if you go up to the Bronx today, it is a very Latino neighborhood. It is very Latino. It is very Black American. It's also very Caribbean and African, right? And that is to me the most perfect representation of what this music is, right? So that New York sound is what is that sound that takes it all, that puts it all together, right? For me, that is bands like Fort Apache. That is musicians like Kenny Kirkland, right? Kenny Kirkland plays with Branford Marsalis. Kenny Kirkland is an essential member of that young lion generation of jazz, playing with cats like Charlotte Moffett and Christian McBride, right? Kenny Kirkland is half Puerto Rican. Kenny Kirkland grows up with Andy and Jerry Gonzalez. Kenny Kirkland plays crazy tumbas on piano. So my whole point is that these musics were separated, but never that separated. Not on the street they weren't separated, right? Because you had folks living in the same neighborhoods. You had folks being tight with each other who were sharing this information. So when Andy and Jerry create the Fort Apache band, they're not creating something new. They are synthesizing the story of their lives and the lives of so many other musicians in New York. And that's why, for me, that is the New York sound, is the reflection of this cultural melting pot that is this city. And that, again, we keep talking about laying seeds. That New York sound lays the seeds for a whole renaissance of how jazz interacts with Latin rhythms across the entire continent that we'll get to in our next episode.